Welcoming Nishant and Padmini back today for our final session. The way this, as I mean, just to sort of bring Padmini and Nishant up to speed, we were just generally having a chat right now about how has it been so far for everyone, or if they have any queries. And more than a couple of people refer to the checklist, Nishant, that we had circulated early on, and that's been quite helpful in getting, looking at pitching where your work is positioned and getting through that context. So that's something that we saw a couple of comments and we spoke about it briefly just before you came in. But just to sort of round everything up with everyone, we started this series of 8 sessions, as you know, with Nishant and Padmini. And the idea of those sessions were largely to look at your relationship and how your practice translates into the digital practice. How do we look at that conversion while keeping in mind some of the more critical frameworks and positionalities that we occupy within this conversation. So the idea was to sort of get you to think through ideas of authorship, authority, and authenticity, and then sort of relating that to thinking about value in your organization, your business, your work with ArtEZ, or for that matter, the barriers and the challenges you encounter while creating work when Archana took you through that entire aspect of creating work in the digital realm. And with audiences, it was about, again, looking at where you are currently with your notion of audience engagement, development, and segmentation, and looking at how those notions change and evolve when you're thinking through digital. So it was all supposed to be, in some sense, your reference points. And that those first 2 sessions laid the pathway for you to think through how your positions change across these subjects and narratives that we're trying to engage you with. So I think just to then sort of round it up, we're now looking at what have those encounters led us to think about and behave perhaps differently in our relationship with digital technologies, frameworks, and perhaps also platforms. So this final session will help us, if not put a nice little pretty bow to our learning, at least figure out what the box for that learning looks like. So with that, I'd like to welcome Nishant and Padmini back. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm personally very excited to see the session, but also hear from you what you think about the session at the end of it, because we've all been through a journey over the last 4 weeks. With that, over to you both.
All right. Okay. Thank you. I didn't realize we would be gate crashing a party. It feels like Padmini and I like the late arrivals who don't yet know what's happening and how we are stitching in. But it's really nice to be a part of the last wrapping up session as well. It was also really, really helpful to get the feedback from all the fellows because it was very interesting to see what are the kinds of things that you are picking up on, but also what are the frameworks that are working. And Padmini and I were laughing and saying, it's really sometimes strange to be in the group, which is which has just so much extraordinary competence and experience to kind of keep on saying, oh yeah, we're going to teach you new things. It's not going to happen. So one of the things we wanted to do today was to revisit some of the ideas that we started with. We haven't, of course, been a part of all the sessions that all of you have gone through, but we are trying to think along with you about how do you kind of make these things more concrete, right? So the checklist was a beginning point to say, all right, these are all the different complexities I'm going to deal with, be it value generation, cultural production, management, archiving, and so on. And how do you then translate it into, so I don't think Padmini and I are equipped enough to tell you A, B, C, D, do this, and it will be done. But I think what we might be able to do is perhaps dwell on the implications of what we have said, right? Like that this is where we might go further in some way. And we come up with a model where I call it my 3-2-1 model. So we are going to talk about 3 things that we have learned in the process of composing this event and lectures. 2 things we think need more conversations and more thought. And 1 thing that each of us feels that we are not yet sure about, that it needs way more thinking through and also practice and even trial and error. And so what we're going to do is we're going to begin with both of us launching into that, and then looking at your feedback, it was obvious that conversations, in fact, help a lot. And so we are going to break you up into small groups where you are going to do this exercise in the group, doing the 3-2-1 thing, saying 3 things that I have learned, 2 things that I really think I'm excited by, but it needs more attention. And one thing where I'm basically like just looking at it and saying, huh, and trying to figure out what happens next with that. And then each group will bring it back into the plenary, and then Padmini and I will try and address the hair question and see if we can shed some light onto it in some ways, right? So that's the format of the next 90 minutes of working together. So we're very excited and looking forward to it. And Padmini's asked me to kick off, but before I do that, Padmini, do you want to add something to this in terms of what we expect to get out of the session?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. So then I'm going to try and do this. So I'm very excited by the fact that the idea of the shift from memory to storage, the three fundamental shifts that were happening in terms of authorship, authenticity, and authority landed. I will tell you for a fact that it's very heartening when these ideas actually land, because they sound really good in your head. But when they get into conversations with people, they really lead to a different kind of a tenor. So I was looking at what would be the three things I want to emphasize beyond what I have already said, right? And I want to offer you, in fact, the idea that specifically when looking at digital practices, if we are going to think through the reconfiguration of the authorship, authenticity, and authority, there might be a way of making it very concrete by locating it in three different axes of transition. And I wanted to just say that if we take the idea of the shift from memory to storage seriously, and if we take this idea of reconfiguring the author authenticity and authorship seriously, then there are at least three things that you might practically want to think about in the digitization of your practice. The first one is perhaps think through the complicated relationship between possibility and probability. And I know this sounds almost like an academic exercise, but this is going to be, I think, very useful to open up our own horizons of how we are thinking through digital practice. So, the possibility and probability distinction often comes from a distinction between mathematics and logic, in fact. So the first order of logic and the first order of mathematics, which are often confused, needs to be perhaps pulled out in order for you to understand how you are shaping your digital practice. The easiest way, of course, of doing this is to take a very literal example, right? So if I took up my phone and if I threw it up in the air, which I'm not going to because it's way too expensive to do it. But if I had to throw my phone up in the air and if I asked you what would happen next, you know the answer, right? The answer is that the phone would fall down. Now, the reason you know this is not because you have extraordinary knowledge of gravitational pull, because you know theories of relativity, or that you have been taught like specific ways by which objects have a hyperbolic or a parabolic route and then they travel and so on and so forth. You know this simply because you have seen this before, right? Like we know that when objects are thrown up, they fall down. And the more we have seen that objects which are thrown up fall down, the more we know that that's the most probable answer that you could possibly give. Yeah. What you have effectively done is what our algorithms do all the time. You've done pattern recognition. You have recognized a pattern and you have realized that the outcome of this pattern is going to be more or less the same no matter what the object is. If you were to ask the same question to a mathematician, you realize that they will be completely paralyzed by this question. Because if a mathematician was asked what would happen to that phone, they would have to compute a universe where there is a possibility, right? A very distinct possibility that the phone might travel through a wormhole which has opened up above my head. It goes into another dimension where it falls on the head of another Nishant who's doing this talk and kills him. Thus, of course, beginning the best science fiction novel of whether this was murder or suicide. But that's like a completely different idea. But you want to understand that the potentials for possibility, which are mathematical, and the potentials of probability, which are logical, are both embedded in the digital systems. Increasingly, our off-the-shelf big data systems and systems which practice algorithmic curation prefer probability because probability is simpler. right? It does away with messiness. It tells you that this is the most probable thing, and then there will be outliers. But one of the things that we can do is, in fact, definitely insist that we want to be mathematical in our computational and digital practices. And this is something that's useful because we have to remember that mathematics is not really science, it's art, right? It is a particular set of abstractions. I mean, in no other discipline that I can think of, can a teacher walk into a classroom, hold out their hand and say, imagine that this is a point, right? You have to do this incredible leap of faith and saying, imagine that this is a point, and then you have to work out an entire working theory of the universe within which that point makes sense. So these mathematical possibilities, which are in fact very close to the idea of computational practices, but also very close to artistic ways, are embedded in our technologies. They are not present. They are not something that we have to additionally add there. So I would urge you to think about, when you are making your digital choices, are you going back to the probable or are you thinking through the possible? What are the possibility horizons within the framework, and what you don't need to be constrained by in terms of what the platform or the technology already has to offer. So that's something I think I'm learning as we kind of have these conversations, and I wanted to present that as the first. The second thing which I thought I'm learning a lot right now from the conversations we had, especially in the breakout sessions and the feedback, was to think through this question between veracity and verification, right? Or the capacity to tell the truth and to capacity to verify that somebody is telling the truth. So some of you might have heard me talk about this because I have been doing a lot of work around the Aadhaar project for the last 10 years. And one of the things that we had discovered in our first live ethnography of the project was this Aadhaar ID of a dog, right? I don't know if you're already familiar with that. But Tommy Singh is this white Pomeranian who actually got an Aadhaar card with his face on it. And when we discovered it in the early phase of the Aadhaar implementation, we saw that, okay, well, first I thought it was an art project, right? It looked like something like an art intervention would be within the privacy debates in Aadhaar, but it turned out that it was a real card. And not only was it a real card, but it was also a card which had been used, which means that it had an operational bank account, and it had even a subsidy for a government loan, which was attached to it. So we went searching for the bank officer who basically approved of this identity of this dog and the card that was attached to it. And we actually found this really nice old man, who sits as a clerk in a bank. And then we said, but how did you do this, right? You looked at a card, it said it belonged to a dog. Like, what happened? And then in a very non-ironical way, the clerk said, yeah, we know that it was a dog, but the computer said that it's all right? That my human discernment, my capacity to identify the truthiness of this particular transaction was overwritten and overridden by machine verification systems. It's interesting to realize that within arts and cultures, we have not cared so much about verification except when it comes to evaluation of authenticity. In fact, selling fakeness is our bread and butter. Fictions are fake. I mean, it's precisely because they are fake that they are so real. So how are you going to make this distinction between the need for fakeness and the need for fiction and kind of balance it out with the need for facts and verified, quantified, measurable entities? And perhaps the biggest challenge that's going to come to you in this is at the level of audience generation, right? Do you really need to identify your audience? Do you really need their data? What do you need to know their address for? Who are you serving when you are taking an enormous amount of user data and then converting it into probability and statistical models? Is there a way by which we can resist the database and hence go on what Padmini has said, move to the archive, right? An archive which doesn't necessarily need extraordinarily verifications, and it doesn't need facts, but it needs truthiness, right? Sense of truth, one way or the other. So that would be my second thing I want to kind of re-emphasize. And the third really is very simple. It's something that doesn't need preaching at all, is just to move between the tension of the individual and the collective. And I'm not saying this in this very romantic, oh, we should all be together and do something. But I'm really thinking about the individual, which is also perhaps the more institutional, as well as the collective, and which is the informal. And in the last 3 weeks, Netherlands has now imposed even stricter lockdowns, like everything is shut down starting today. And I haven't seen any of my first year students who came in since August in person. Like it just hasn't happened. And one of the conversations that's been continuously happening is, do we really need the university if Zoom is all we seem to need in order to actually get our work done? The students have been asking that question, saying, why am I exactly at an art university? And surprisingly, administrators are asking the question, right? Saying, why do we have so many employees and so much infrastructure when apparently everything that we do happens in this space? And it's been an interesting exercise to realize that outside of this institutional mandate of what we are as an arts and culture university, there is something more to us. So we've realized that we are not a space for information transfer. We've realized that we're not even a place for infrastructure for doing arts and culture production, even though, of course, we do have state-of-the-art studios and lots of machines and devices that artists can use. We quickly, to our great discomfort, realize that we are not even a place for expertise that is rare and common. We are, in fact, completely replaceable by a variety of other information resources which are available to our students online. And we obviously are not a physical place where people had to come. And from there on, we've been starting the question saying, so what exactly are our institutional spaces for? And if we are going to continue our institutions to live in the pandemic, but also beyond the pandemic, it's an interesting question. Like, we will exist because we are too big to fail. Right? We will exist because we are a public art university and the entire sector is not going to collapse. But what our role is going to be is interesting. And one of the things that has come up is, I think in our conversations as well, is to move the conversation from the work of doing arts and cultures, which is an institutional question, and move it to the work that arts and cultures do in our society, which is a collective question. And reformulating that has been important, that we might not be any of the things that I have listed down, but what we do have is a set of values and a set of principles and a set of competencies which deliver those in some way. So this is something that's useful for a lot of you, because I think there is a tension between the institutional and the collective that's going on right now. So these are the three things that I have learned, which I wanted to put out. The two things I think what we want to need to perhaps more thinking about. One is the tyranny of the thing. With the digital comes the idea that everything needs to be tangible, right? And mostly everything that is tangible is also everything that is the visual. I think the one thing that Padmini so brilliantly kind of helped figure out is to move beyond the imperative of interfaces and platforms and think about the digital not just as a thing, but as a process, as a space, as an intention. And I think that's something I would really love to think more about. How do we go out of what Karen Barad calls the thingification of our life, right? How do you not use the digital as an excuse to just transform everything into a thing? And if everything cannot be put into a thing, then what are the kinds of experiments that would be needed to go beyond the graphical user interface and also producing things which are not things or which cannot be recognized as things, right? So this is where your resistance to algorithms, databases, and networks also come into play. The second thing was a comment that one of the fellows had made after my talk, which was, when I had presented the idea that we move into economies of intensity rather than economies of scale. I've been toying around with the idea of an anti-circulation network. Is it possible to build a network which is not built to circulate information as a default? But when information becomes intensified, it is then allowed to travel and be circulated, but with caution and with care. So I think that's something I would really like to think more about, and really thinking through then the network, both in terms of fidelity as well as resolution, right? Because fidelity in a network is about how it corresponds to the external reality that it is constructed by. whereas resolution is in fact the depth and the description that goes within a network to go towards something else. And then the one thing that is my question is really trying to say, is there a possibility for a narrative digital practice as opposed to a data digital practice? One of the things that I had kind of mentioned in passing in our conversations was, what happens if you stop using the word data and replace it with people? And, rhetorically and at a very humane level, it sounds really exciting. But what does it really translate into is something I would really want to think through. Because if we go out of the data practices in some way, and we replace it with human practices, then what would those human practices be? And I'm very curious to kind of expand more, maybe in the building of the open education resources later. How can we build narrative practices of change, right? And what are the narrative digital practices? What are the ways in which I like the idea of the narrative, because it doesn't do this human versus technology, but in fact talks about technological affordances that the human creators can use in order to build different kinds of narrative systems. Okay, that's my 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to hand over straight to Padmini.
The first thing that I wanted to kind of touch upon, which is, I actually feel like this 3 to 1 kind of distinction is a difficult one, because they all kind of overlap, right? Because the more you think about something, you kind of come to a point where you feel like, oh, I think I've reached a point where I've resolved that question, but that opens up another question, which I guess becomes the kind of second things that you're thinking about. But I think something that I have been thinking about a lot in our own work at Design Beku, and I feel like something that might resonate with some of you, is what does it mean to be an institution? So I kind of in particular want to draw your attention to something that Sarah Ahmed, whose work I greatly admire, said. And so Sarah Ahmed has written several kind of works about complaint in the institution, and how do we frame these complaints as a kind of as a feminist act. And so she says, and I'm just quoting a little bit. So she says that one practitioner describes the job of working in an institution as banging your head against the brick wall job. Even if you are appointed by an institution to transform the institution, it does not mean that the institution is willing to be transformed. In fact, many practitioners encounter resistance to their work. Diversity is work because of that resistance. You have to find ways to get through because you are blocked. This is why I call diversity workers institutional plumbers. They have to work out where the blockage is or what stops something from moving through the system. And I think, something that became very clear to both Nishant and myself when, we were doing the breakout sessions, is that all of you have kind of, tremendously kind of novel and generous ways of thinking that actually I think are quite often kind of in opposition to institutional frameworks. And so while this gives me great hope and joy, I kind of do also appreciate that, there's a very fine balance between kind of championing these values and ideas, but how to kind of push them through in an institution. And I think something that I kind of think a lot about is that how do we kind of work with these as core values, and core community values that can show kind of institutions kind of the transformative nature of these kind of assumptions. And I think something that I'm always kind of there's always a tension, I think, between the ossification of the institution. So I think an institution becomes an institution when its values get ossified. So in order for it to, actually kind of grow and be generative, it also has to be, a kind of place of constant ferment, right? So there's a lot of gardening and organic metaphors. I'm sorry, but I feel like that's actually possibly quite opposite. So yeah, so I think what I would really kind of like to see, because, you know, it was so evident in what all of you shared with us, is that, you know, you all have within you the kind of impulse, the transformative impulses that can actually really shift what we think about as arts and culture institutions. And I really kind of, you know, hope that you kind of manage to, within, you know, this community that you've built here, maybe even find the kind of support and the kind of conviction, I guess, to kind of carry through these ways of thinking, because I think that's incredibly promising. And, you know, as Nishant said at the outset, you know, we were very impressed by, you know, the breadth of your knowledge and also the kind of thoughtfulness with which you were thinking about your roles as, you know, practitioners in these spaces. So I think for me, one kind of core kind of issue that, you know, I'm grappling with, and I'm sure all of you are also challenged by, is the relationship with the institution, and at what part, you know, at what point can, you know, you hope to move an institution towards a space where it is no longer an institution, but rather something that is an institution always in the making, which I think is a really difficult thing to do, but if possible, then you know, it's very regenerative and has a lot of promise. I think the second thing was, I think, you know, definitely from the conversations about you know, archives, which are kind of very far-ranging. I think something that somebody said in the feedback, and I think this is really interesting. I don't know who it is, but they said that I was surprised the idea of authenticity was not grounded in a community where one could gauge its authenticity. And I think this is really interesting because there is obviously an inside and an outside, right? Like, you know, so this conversation is happening within a certain space. And, you know, we had kind of long and detailed conversations about what it meant to work with communities and, you know, how does one kind of ensure working with communities in an ethical fashion, in a non-extractive fashion. But yes, the community is not in the room. So how do we kind of ensure that, you know, these conversations that we are having are actually then kind of, you know, the kind of made real. And I think one of the kind of best ways to do that is to kind of bring these conversations to communities. There is no way to do this remotely, right? I think, you know, I think it's very constructive to have these conversations, but ultimately one has to be open to the possibility of taking these conversations to communities and then be challenged. So I think, you know, it's possible to kind of think that, okay, we've got it all figured out, but then, you know, to have the kind of humility to go to communities and realize that maybe because of certain contexts, because of certain conditions, certain ways of working and certain ways of thinking through, say, for example, the archive will not work for them. So I think, you know, just kind of being, you know, constantly open to that. I guess it's, again, you know, funnily enough, it kind of resonates with my first point, which is just not to be too exacting and to allow kind of some space for kind of flexibility and openness. I think my third point would be, unsurprisingly, about the archives and kind of about kind of feminist practices of archiving. I think one thing that I'm really kind of, and I was working on another project that kind of, I think, kind of has informed this perspective, is that how the archive, especially the digital archive, has a slight danger of becoming very flattened. And I say this because, you know, when we have worked with archival materials in the past, you know, there were things that, you had a haptic relationship with, which was very different, like, you know, paper, for example, or parchment or objects, right? But when the archive becomes a digital archive, to my mind, it almost kind of verges on becoming like sensory deprivation. Because there's nothing more to it apart from visuality. That becomes, you know, the main way and the main means through which we are accessing the archive. So I think one question that I'm going to cheat a little because I think it's my third point, but it's also something that I'm learning about, so there's a bit of an overlap here, is that how do we make sure that archives are can provoke the affect that they contain? Right. So I think, you know, I'll just kind of give you some context. I've been thinking about this very much in the context of archiving protest. And I know some of you also mentioned similar kind of experiences and desires. And, you know, how does one archive something like anger, which is, you know, pretty much archiving protest, and not lose the kind of visceral affective charge of anger in the archive, right? And I think, all of you come from different kinds of backgrounds in terms of, what your organizations do, in terms of performance, in terms of art, in terms of curation. And I think, I think this is something I would love to see explored in different ways, that how do we kind of, because we've become so accustomed to the digital archive, right? Like, so, if I'm to be quite, play loose and fast with the definition of an archive, Instagram, just scrolling through, Instagram, it is a way of scrolling through a digital archive. And we know that we no longer are we are kind of desensitized through that, kind of, as we call it, doom scrolling now, right? So how do we kind of make sure that the archive does not lose its kind of vitality, its urgency when it moves into the digital space, is something that I'm very curious to work with and to think about. And I feel that one of the salvations for that is art. So, how do artists, how do creative practitioners interpret the archive and put out the archive in different ways than just, what we see right now? I think has a lot of potential, and I think would be quite exciting to explore. The second thing that, I'm thinking a little bit about is, and I think this did come up last time, is how do we build consensus, right? Like, so how do we, again, when we're working with different communities, within communities, we know that there might be fractures and differences. How do we actually kind of, is it possible to actually have a kind of template for consensus building? Or is that, again, something that we need to learn how to build depending on the context that we're working in? And what are the kind of questions that we ask? And what are the kinds of, fractures that might occur? So they might be generational, they might be aspirational in terms of, financial and economic. They might be about, again, something that came up quite a lot when we spoke last, about, between privacy, and display, right? Like, so that tension between wanting to be seen, but also not wanting to be seen, depending on how high those stakes are. So I think, this conversation about consensus building is something that I'm still working through. And I think it depends on, again, very much on who we're working with and what are the questions that need to be asked. But I think it's something that we can't rest easy about. I think it's something that we have to constantly kind of reconsider as we go along. And the last question, I think, is actually it's a little bit similar to Nishant's. Is that how do we stop the digital being kind of quite so? So okay, I'll give you a kind of where this is coming from. So in Calcutta, which is where I come from, there is currently some of you might even know, I think Arts Forward is doing this project about taking the arts back outside, right? And there has been this kind of, whether we like it or not, there's been this kind of like defiance that the lockdown has put upon us, that people have become very like, I refuse to be locked down anymore, and I must go back outside, and what is this kind of ridiculous, unnatural situation, and which has, as a consequence, made an enemy of the digital. And I wonder what to do with this relationship. I think this is something that has kind of confused me a little, in that there are obviously very, very real and serious reasons why we are all behind a screen, and it is not a conspiracy, say, on the part of Zoom to increase its clientele. So how do we make this relationship with the digital kind of somewhere, something that is not quite so extreme in its kind of our relationship to it, right? Like, I think one very good example of this is, again, for those of you who have seen The Social Dilemma, one ridiculous thing about that documentary and about the people who are speaking for the technology industry in that documentary is that there's this constant kind of pathologization of technology, right? Oh, it's so addictive and teenagers are getting addicted, and and so the whole kind of onus falls on us. And I just kind of I'm very, very kind of, I guess, just kind of concerned how we can get away from this kind of very extreme relationship that we have with technology, that either it is all, wonderful and, utopian, or it is completely dire and, causing the downfall of civilization. There has to be, if we've made our peace with, pencils and books and bicycles, all of which are technologies, why, what is happening here that is preventing us from doing that? And I think that's something that, and I think it is worth saying that, the famous kind of judgment of Themis argument about writing, right? So this argument that's made that writing is a pharmacon. It is both harmful, or it was considered both harmful, but also of great value, right? So again, we've come back around to this real concern with what is the impact of this technology. And it's something, that I don't know how we're going to kind of, as humanity, kind of come to terms with, but it is something that I wonder about quite a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot, Padmini. So as you can see, we've been kind of bubbling over with questions and ideas and what we have taken over. We really didn't want to go into a Q&A because that feels like an inadequate form of thinking through this. So we are immediately going to break up in groups. By the power of Zoom and the magic of Dipti, we are going to be just sorted and put into groups. We have 20 minutes for this exercise, and what we would encourage you to do is collectively come up with a 3-2-1 like this, right? So begin with where you have found something which is exciting and interesting, but as a group, is it possible for you to think very concretely about 3 things that you have learned, 2 things that you want to think more about, and 1 point which is really the hair question going on. So we're going to break up immediately into groups. We're going to perform this small exercise within the group together. And I think after that, there's a small break and we come back into plenary. And then Padmini and I will hope to pick up some of the points and respond in whatever our capacities might be at that point. Is somebody volunteering from group 1?
Okay, so I'm speaking on behalf of Kritika, Rajatri, Karan, and Siddhant. And our 3 learnings. The first learning was about authorship and being an author in an online space when there are so many collaborators. So Karan specified that, when there are so many variables, like how do you really observe that shift and how do you really define what that means for us? The second learning from that was about value generation and audience building. So we were looking at how, there were different sets of people where, Anshul spoke about amateurs, connoisseurs, and novices. And it was an interesting learning to see how we can tailor our work according to these different audience segments and these different sections that Anshul helped us with. Yeah, that sounds it.
Wow, thank you so much, Vaishnavi. That was really, really helpful. The group number 5.
Hi. So we didn't actually end up deciding who would go, but I have the notes with me. This is Saili. And my group had Varun, Maithili, Asavari, Madhu, and Samarth. So the 3 things that we were excited about, the first one was ArtEZ session, entirely about the different revenue models, the business models that he talked about, and then looking at our own institutions in the lens of amateur, connoisseur, and novice, like what is our audience base, how much of it should we target, etc. Then the second being focusing on creating value through our work. So everyone agreed on this as the second point. And the third was analyzing our own audience development and segmentation in our respective works. So these were the 3 things that all of us collectively agreed upon, that we were excited on. Moving on to the 2 things that need further thought. First one being how to build a digital community now that we've all pivoted to the digital space, or rather forced to pivot to the digital space, when we have such wavering attention spans. And as Padmini spoke about, the defiance that is sort of setting in, that, okay, no, we don't want to look at the digital anymore. And another concern being that how do we sustain the engagement level when we are returning back to whatever the said normal was? And the second thing that needed more thought was, now that everyone is online, we are consuming massive amounts of digital content. That is great. We have access to things, but there's also an overwhelming supply of data that the audience is bombarded by. So how do we look at our own content strategy in the middle of this data overload that we are facing? And also that leads to a fair amount of fatigue, we agreed on. And then the final question, the hair question, was on funding, how to secure or garner funding as a cultural institution. Like, yes, we learned about revenue models, we looked at cost models, but that was more from an entrepreneur perspective. Like, okay, if you want to like launch your own business, but as we were correctly discussing about institutions and, you know, like the possibility, probability, like the difference between what you can actually do and what actually happens. And most of us working in such cultural spaces, like what makes corporate these big corporates invest in the arts through their foundations? What are the goals, grant proposals? So that was like our question. So yeah, that was it from our end. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I mean, that's like literally the $1 billion question, right? Saying how do you get that money secured to kind of do the kind of work that you have to do. Thank you. Group number 6.
Hi, I'll be going through the points from everyone in the group. So the command point was about audience. So 3 things that he learned was about audience segmentation, especially in the kind of work that he is doing, and collaborations, and being open to the idea of collaborations. The third being thinking about revenue, especially with the kind of practice the kind of work that he's been doing. Bhavan was talking about digital as a process and the possibilities that comes with it, and learning to really look at digital as a process in a way. The second being, what can arts do for society, and the point that Nishant also raised, but also looking at how it just not about scale, or not just about scaling, but also looking about how communities can really play a bigger role in it. So we spoke about audience development as well, but mostly about how digital can achieve the democratization of arts and culture. And the second point being figuring out the difference between theoretical and practical. That's also something that she is excited about and would like to look at a departure point, so how to take that forward, which is also actually one of her needs more attention point. I spoke about, or I contributed about the point of moving beyond platforms, and how when I looked at art digital, I really looked at it from the point of looking at working with platforms, but actually when Padmini spoke about moving beyond it, really helped me learn how I should actually be open to that idea. Then looking at the tools that Archel gave us about creating value in cultural businesses, and how to apply that to our individual practices. Understanding the umbrella term of audience development, because it being so vast, and kind of moving very deeply into it. The tools that some of us looked at was about peer conversations and feedback that we got while doing all the sessions, and also being open to the idea of collaborations in trans mediums, and how we can do that better. The other thing was about, Kumam spoke about community versus audience, and how dissecting that and being excited about that. Also about interface and how interface can be reworked, and just the idea of how interface can be reworked is very exciting to him. Aishwarya spoke about conducting the module in a very, so she spoke about this one point of learning, how learning from the way the entire module has been conducted, and how in a very small and very effective way, it has really helped, that has really helped her learn how a great support system can be created in a particular course, and how you can run something in smaller ways like feedbacks, and keeping a check with us, and being very responsive at most points. That's something that's a huge learn that she's received from this module. The other being connecting with people, with like-minded people, but also working in various different practices in their own way. Where she spoke about how she has been absorbing so much, but she wants to see how and where it leads, and that being like that. Therefore, she couldn't come up with no hair points. So the two gray areas that we spoke about was one being the issue of constantly reinventing your business, and while keeping it authentic, while keeping the authenticity behind it intact in the digital space. And the second being that Bhavan raised was for arts and in the arts sector, not which is not creating on a more bigger scales. The problems are also smaller. So these are niche problems. So maybe looking at it from a general solution point of view is something like, it's a very gray area where he wants to look at solutions from understanding them from each particular respective subjective areas. So that's something that he has been, he feels needs more attention. I hope I've covered all points, team, but if you want to just, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shraddha. And I think the sessions were also recorded and there will be notes made out of it, but this was, more kind of an indicative landscape of where the key questions are. This is very rich and very productive, but I also want to make us very critically aware that Padmini and I do not necessarily have the competence to address all the questions. I think they belong to a lot of the other instructors who stepped in. Once we are done with the wrap up, almost everyone else is coming back. So maybe they can pick up some of those questions, and Rashmi, maybe you can guide those questions to the other instructors so that there can be a fruitful conversation. But Padmini and I will just trying to think through some of these things. And I'm going to first begin by asking Padmini to just reflect on things that she wants to pick up and address.
Sorry, I'm just laughing at what was just said in the chat box. You're also free to just ask us. You don't have to Google. Right now, I'm feeling very conscious that I can't use certain words. Okay, so I think I want to pick up on a few things. I mean, those are all really fantastic points, and it's I mean, as Nishant said, I think it kind of really kind of paves the way for, how kind of what are the, I wouldn't say pain points, but what are the points of interest? I mean, I think it is obvious, like, through all of your accounts, that there are some common areas where people kind of want some more clarity or are thinking very deeply about. So one thing that I want to just kind of say about the digital divide question is that just like I said that, being digital doesn't always mean being networked. I guess a corollary of that is that just because somebody is digital doesn't mean they use the digital in the same way that you imagine that they might use it. So I think there are definitely cultures of use in the digital that one cannot assume. And so I would say that, and I think this kind of connects to questions of, say, audience development. Again, in order to kind of understand, the way that your audience uses the digital is quite crucial. I don't think it's something that you can make assumptions about, that just because somebody has a digital device means that they kind of use or think about the digital in the way that you imagine the digital. So I think the imaginations of the digital are something that are definitely not uniform. I think they are, again, dictated by language, by culture, by, economic background, by education. There's several factors here. So I think that's just kind of worth kind of just remembering. And I think that actually kind of neatly brings me to, I think, in the last group, somebody mentioned this point, and I think one of the earlier groups, about scale. And so I think what's interesting is that, I mean, one of the reasons why, the digital is so kind of valorized is this idea that, digital allows scale. But what I would actually say is that think of, you can also kind of flip that around. Like at this particular moment, I think the digital can be used for the opposite of scale. And I think that has a lot of potential because, this kind of proximity, this kind of intimacy, it kind of allows for almost like boutique experiences, right? You don't have to kind of think of something that you can replicate again and again. And I think, having that kind of imagination and flexibility is actually something that can only work in favor of, a creative organization, right? Like, kind of trying to think about ways of reinventing, what does it mean to have performance after performance, night after night, right? How is it different now than it has been in the past? So I think, not necessarily thinking of scale again as the inevitability of the digital, but maybe rather challenging, the idea of, just because it's digital, it must scale. I think, just kind of maybe kind of keeping that, that clarity is I think useful. I think, right. Yes. Great. So yeah. And I think what I thought was really interesting and quite lovely was like the meta kind of conversation that emerged at, what you said about this being a place for community and how you all learn from each other, and you've, kind of brought problems and issues to the fore, and, you've had experiences that you've shared. And I think that is absolutely fantastic. And I think, we mentioned the OER in the chat, and I think that will be a place that maybe we can, kind of, think about even recording some of your experiences that might kind of, kind of create case studies and kind of, we find points of similarity and difference. So I think, as one of the groups said, the hang question about funding, I mean, that is obviously clearly a universal question, right? And so how do we kind of approach that? I'll pause for now, let Nishant take over, and we can kind of play tag.
Yeah, thank you. This is already good. As while you were talking, I was like scratching out things in terms of points that you already addressed. So maybe I can pick up on some other things, which is always fun. I want to pick up on maybe 4 things that I'm hearing. I think one is the question of liveness, right? And this is going to be really interesting both for long duration and performance art practices, but even for visual art practices now, because there has been this imagination that visual art practice is static, and so it's easier to translate it into an online experience, right? At the end of the day, there is like a product which can be kind of digitized in some way. But I think what has become really crucial right now is that there is something which is live, and then there is a performance of liveness, and perhaps we need to make a distinction between that. One of the things that I'm seeing right now is how especially within performance arts, there is a way by which the aesthetics of liveness can make it possible where you can still have very small audiences interact with the same performance or the same duration practice and still not know that it was all recorded. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, we've been doing this with a lot of the webinars that we are conducting, where we actually have a professional photographer and lights and studio practices and so on, but then we are recording the webinar or the person speaking on Zoom screens, and we are presenting it, and our students really think that it is live, right? Like it's happening in real time on a Zoom call. But what's become really interesting is that the possibility that the digital offers is actually manipulation of time, right? So what you have lost is the manipulation of space, but what you have gained is the manipulation of time. So really thinking through these questions of synchronicity, or rather asynchronicity, distributedness, stitching together, fragmentation, modularization, all of these things that are often considered as the problems of the digital are also sometimes the ways by which you might be able to restitch this. So I would really encourage us to think about what is the digital, because at its very heart, right, at its extremely basic fundamental core, the computer is just a timekeeping device. It obsessively and neurotically keeps time. And in through keeping time, it then rearranges data, rearranges electricity, rearranges power grids, and so on and so forth, to eventually give you simulations of these images and sounds and so on. So it would be very good to think through this question of liveness when it comes to performance, but also then digitization. So when you are digitizing something, you are not translating it, you are recalibrating it in time. And thinking through that at a practical level might be very useful. The question of authenticity and appropriation, I'm guessing this also happened in another conversation when you were talking about production of culture. I want to make a very straightforward provocation to you. All digitization is an act of appropriation. Not necessarily cultural appropriation, but an appropriation. And putting yourself in that condition, right? Saying that if you had these ethics and political considerations of cultural appropriation, apply all of them right next to digital appropriation. Because to take an object, a practice, a body, a community outside of its context and make it intelligible to the systems that it was not designed for. So we often make a distinction between born digital objects and objects which were transferred into the digital. And I would propose to think of all transference as acts of appropriation in some way or the other, and see what it yields for you in making certain choices. The third is this, democratization that the digital brings in. I want to just have a small cautionary note saying that this is the 1990s manifesto of the World Wide Web about how the digital will in fact make democratization possible. And in many ways it does. My only concern is that democratization is an extremely flawed process which concentrates largely only on those who have the capacity to claim rights for themselves. Right? Democracy is not an inclusive project, it's a majoritarian project. Our democracies are built almost entirely on identifying people who have the capacity and the rights to bring somebody into the conversational fold and then deal with them in specific ways. So it might be good to see that democratization in the digital has a very straightforward trajectory. It begins by saying that in order for the democratization to happen, access has to happen. So we invest a lot in infrastructure, connectivity, resources, and so on. Once access has been established, you immediately realize that it's not going to be enough because, as Padmini pointed out, just because somebody has access doesn't mean that they are actually being able to participate. So the next thing you would say is, okay, access has been granted, but the inclusion still needs to be done, right? Just because you built a computer doesn't mean that somebody is going to use it. So you then go into a lot of literacy, and a lot of different questions of rehabilitating people, training them, and so on and so forth. And we know that once digital inclusion projects have kind of been implemented, you realize that just because somebody is included does not mean that they are present or that their presence is acknowledged or felt. In fact, one of the biggest performances of inclusion you can do is to give access to all the disenfranchised people, do their inclusion training, and then ignore them once they are a part of the conversation, or systematically troll them, gaslight them, and so on, which is what has happened with a lot of gendered practices online, where we first went into this, oh, we need more women in computing, so let's, build infrastructure through STEM education. Then let's bring those women onto computational spaces by including them. And then once they put out their voice, or once they dare to say something that's resisting the status quo, let's troll them, dox them, make their lives miserable in general. So just making you aware that democratization has these very specific ideas, and it might be good to move out of that celebrating of democratization principles of the internet. And the fourth thing, which I think everybody is hearing, is, all right, all this theorization and everything is fine, paisa kahan hai? Like, where are you going to find the funding from? And this is going to become incredibly fraught thing. I want you to realize that one of the things that has happened with the funding scene, at least when I'm sitting in Europe, is that, a large part of the Global South arts and culture organizations have always worked on a patronage model, right? I mean, that's like the straightforward way of saying it, that there's a specific amount of excess that comes from the Global North, which gets invested in organizations that we run, because there is an imagination that these are organizations which are working in precariousness, or they are critical, or they are lacking resources, and so on. What the current pandemic has done is that it has allowed every Global North organization to present itself as something that is critical, something that's precarious, something that is going to be needing extraordinary support, right? So in the Netherlands, we have this entire campaign of Koop Lokaal, which is buy local, and that includes arts and culture organizations. So you have to start preparing for a fact that the inflow of Global North funding into Global South is going to become even more difficult. One, because there is governmental funding cuts in this part of the world, but also because suddenly it's like, oh, we need to first preserve our arts and culture institutions, which we thought were infallible because they are supported by money of different kinds. And then there is a clear answer that you are already all thinking through, saying the collective is the only way forward. If you are thinking about raising funds, do not compete with each other, collaborate. Form a collective, saying that if there is a scarcity, don't intensify it by a winner takes all model, but instead try and figure out how are you going to just distribute these funds more and more. And as Rashmi points out, with the new FCRA rules, this is going to become even more important, that there is a collective which is applying for this funding, which can then hopefully also distribute funds with equity. Okay, I'm going to stop here. This is a very rich conversation and lots of things to take away. But Padmini, do you want to add something? And then we also have to do a final wrap up and say goodbye.
No, I think between us we've covered quite a lot. I think just a kind of one last thing. Obviously about archives, but I did kind of since it's come up again and again, I just kind of wanted to touch upon making the most of the archive. In that, I think there is this notion that, and I think, Nishant made this point actually last time as well, that an archive is never complete, right? It's always in the act of, emergence. It's always kind of, and it's also, an archive is also, kind of very much, it's never neutral as well, right? So I think one thing that I would just kind of advice, I guess, for want of a better word, is to think about the different ways in which, say, you have a cultural institution or an organization, the ways in which you might be able to kind of almost kind of cut, slice, and kind of optimize that archive. There are different ways in which you can draw on your archive that can, kind of inform future work, that can inform, the way you think about audiences. That, it's not necessarily, because I when institutions come to me about, wanting to archive, there's always a bit of a panic that, oh my God, this is incredibly overwhelming, it's very expensive, all of these things. But I think if one is clear as to the logic of collection, as in what is motivating that archiving activity, it can range again in scale. It can be, very kind of minute, or it can be, kind of an institution-wide, kind of undertaking. So I think just kind of bearing in mind that it's not antithetical to the archive to archive at a small or at a minute level, right? I think we're just kind of, I think we always kind of get bogged down again in this idea of the archive having to be complete and authentic. I think, these are kind of, I guess, they're kind of, I feel like they're kind of not actually important questions. I think it's more important to think about the process and the kind of the motivation for undertaking such an activity, and what the guiding logic might be for building a collection of whatever size.
Okay, that sounds like a really good note to end on. We really did not want to go into a Q&A session, but we just wanted a larger reflection session. And I think there is more space going on after this, where Rashmi is going to lead you all into what she's calling a gratitude session, which I'm very curious about. Unfortunately, I won't be able to join that. So this is a point for me to say thank you for your patience, for engaging in this very distributed space, for just the amount of care and expertise and competence all of you are bringing into these conversations. It's really appreciated. And I hope that this is the beginning point of building the open education resources. As all of you know, I'm fairly accessible online, so this is not the end of the conversation. Please just find me. Just don't email me. Do anything except for emailing me. But on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever, just give me a buzz if you want more conversations. Or of course on Dara, because I'm subscribed to it, but like Rashmi, my notifications are also turned off. But in general, yes, please feel free to reach out if there is anything I can do to help connect, at least share some of the things that we have. It would be great. But thank you very much for pulling it all together. And thanks especially to the ArtEZ and the Goethe team. You guys have been phenomenal in just taking us through this incredibly intense and very, very rich conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nishant and Padmini, for this. I'm sorry we don't have time for questions for these two, but it's an open invitation. So please feel free to get in touch with them. I mean, I was also making notes while all of you were sharing, but it just, I think it's one thing to have a reflection session. It's another thing to sort of connect all of that to where you stand, where you're uncomfortable, and where you feel you need to create pathways. So I think just being okay with that discomfort is and recognizing the discomfort to begin with, I think is what I took away in a big way from the way you've navigated and maneuvered the session. So really, thank you for that. And I'm quite sure that we'll have a lot of questions coming in later as well. What we have is a series of questions for you. And what we also have is 2 minutes between each question. So I will have my time on and I'll ask you to sort of move on as you go along. And the focus of this session is, we were seeing some of your, of course, feedback across all sessions. And some of the things that came through very strongly was, of course, it's been really intense. There are lots of conversations that have happened. There's lots of new terminologies that have been introduced. And there's a lot of reflection also for yourself about your work and where you stand. And we wanted to sort of have the next 20 minutes just to sort of hold space for yourself and the cohort that you've been through this entire journey with. So that's primarily what we're going to dive into. Can we move on to the next slide? So my first question for you is if you can identify 3 things that you feel grateful for and appreciate about your work currently. It doesn't have to be related to the last 4 weeks, but just about your work. And actually, I'm going to also ask Dipti and Vidushi and Padmini to do this if you'd like. It'll be great if everybody chips in, including Amrita, and participates. You don't have to share any of this. So it's completely on you. We're not going to ask you to share anything. From not all the questions, a couple of questions we might. So your time starts now. Just 2 minutes. So we're going to move on to the next slide. I hope you've all had a chance. Everybody is okay? Has everybody had a chance to write? Was the time okay? Okay, great. And I'll give you an example. I think I take, my teams really trained me how to behave well on platforms like Asana and Slack and follow through things, right, on those platforms. And that actually helped us work really, really effectively, particularly during the lockdown, and shaped the way we work with each other over the next few months since the lockdown started. And for me, I realized that's something I'm really grateful for, for the ownership that my team shows and making sure that everybody is able to walk on the same path. So anything that you feel you've taken for granted, your time starts now. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. Can we have the next question? Now, this is particularly about the last 4 weeks. 3 things that you feel you've learned about yourself in the last 4 weeks and appreciate about yourself in relation to, of course, what you've been learning, but through the last 4 weeks. I've just put on the timer. Okay. Just if everybody could just sort of stop writing and just, come back onto the screen and just be here right now. If you can take a second to perhaps just close your eyes, take a deep breath, and I'm going to say breathe in, breathe out, and then look at this question. And then we're going to give you the last 2 minutes for yourself. So if you can close your eyes, great. It'll be, so I'm just going to give the instructions. So just close your eyes, take a deep breath, breathe in. And breathe out. Breathe out. Okay, you can open your eyes now. And this last question is for you, which is, what do you feel grateful for about your present, where you are at the moment right now? And if you could think about the whole space for learning, sharing, and growing, how are you feeling at the moment? Okay, we can close on the presentation. So what the first three questions which asked you to think about where you are and about your current context, and this last question is mainly for you to go back to. At any point of time, if you're, during your process of thinking about your work or thinking through digital, if you ever find yourself, questioning or perhaps thinking through, not having a block, going back to this might really help for you to, ask yourselves why you are here and where did you start out and what were the sort of places where you felt you learned, you grew, and you appreciated you and your context and people around you during that time. And I find it an excellent way to root yourself during that time when everything seems perhaps too overwhelming. The two questions in the middle about your cohort, and an appreciation note for them is also for us to acknowledge that we never grow alone, we grow with others. And a huge part of the way we designed this program was supposed to be so that we're able to grow with each other, because this entire space, as even Nishant and Padmini were speaking of, is in some sense overwhelming as well, right, for several people. And how do we use this community to be able to work and build together and collaborate? Like I said, you're not required to share those two thank you notes for two people, but it'll be great if you can, just to make sure that we all also feel that we've had some sort of sense of impression on someone. Please do share those notes. It's the last question, the second last question that we had about one person behind you. So that's all that our entire sort of gratitude exercise was about, to get us to just take a step back and appreciate ourselves, our context, our cohort, our community, for setting us off on this new way of thinking and absorbing. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you for playing the game. And I just wanted to also mention that I know that we have two of our facilitators here at the moment. I'm going to hand it over to Amrita to close off the session and final few words, invite our final two facilitators.
So actually, I mean, the thing is that time does fly when you're sort of enjoying yourself, and because I feel like we just started the 8 sessions, and it's almost over. But it's not. I mean, we definitely plan to continue with this project next year as well. First of all, I would like to thank the entire cohort. I mean, you've been very active participants, and it's your enthusiasm actually that has contributed to the success of this series. And also the experts. Thank you for your generosity. So Archana, Achal, Padmini, Nishant, Rashmi, thank you so much. For all the meetings and for basically your generosity. It would not be fair. I have to thank Rashmi. She's been part of the project from day one. I think we started speaking about it late last year when there was no COVID, and we actually had hoped that it would all be in our institute with all of you present and stuff like that. But thank you. And lastly, Dipti and Vidushi and the entire ArtEZ team. And also we will, we hope that we can open our institute, say by Jan or Feb 2021. So that's another couple of months. And that's when we'll get in touch with you, because to do your own presentations at our institute as well, which was part of the open call. Okay, that's it from my end. Just very happy with how everything's turned out, and thanks a lot. And hope to continue working with you. With that, if you guys have any questions for Achal, Archana, or Padmini, or Rashmi, please feel free to ask them now, because then they're gone. Anyway, no, just kidding, but
also, if Archana, would you like to say anything, add to thoughts?
Yeah, of course.
Anything that, I know we've sent you some of the feedback, that not all of it, some of it that we've shared some of the insights from the feedback forms with Archana, Achal, and Padmini. Yeah.
Sure, if I may, thank you so much for that feedback. It was very helpful to hear, and kind of a bit of a ego booster as well. So really, thanks a lot. First time I'm trying out that format, so I really appreciated all the positive stuff you guys said. And I will take into consideration, I think someone said that it could have been done as a homework exercise, so that all of you might have had more time with each other to understand and work together. I totally get that. So maybe next time when and if we do this, we'll work with the ACRI folks and the CMDA folks to see if there's more homework time for all of you. But yeah, that's it. That's it from me. Thanks, guys.
Hi guys, this is Anshul. Well, unlike Archana, I haven't had time to look at the feedback forms yet. They got to me this morning, this afternoon. I can't remember. I saw the email, but I haven't had a chance yet. But the offer still remains open. If anyone wants to share their work with me, and I'll be happy to continue to engage. Online, offline, however. And yeah, learning is a constant exercise. I've learned a lot in the 3 sessions that I ran. And as I always say, learning is not just from somebody you give the pedestal to. We happen to be facilitators, but learning is constant. Learning is happening every day from actually anyone you care to listen to. So yeah, well, so it's a blessing to have a learning mindset, and the fact that you are here suggests that you do. So well, just preserve that. That's a very precious gift. Good luck in your journeys.
Thanks so much, Achal Archana. As I mentioned, open house. Anybody wants to ask, unmute, ask. We have 8 minutes.
So it's not really a question. It's more of it's just more of a sharing. With COVID-19 and being in a region which is more landlocked, geographically and otherwise, like Manipur, it's really landlocked. It's at the extreme corner on the northeastern side. So I think the experience of being here and also working here is definitely different, because I was in Delhi and being there, it was a different feeling. Goethe-Institut, for example, I mean, I had gone there numerous times, so I know how it feels to be in that community. But being here, it's really different. So I think this whole experience of the fellowship, being connected to so many people, again, at the backdrop of the lockdown, it has been really an emotional, connect as well. But I also and meeting some of the people at least, I think I would still feel incomplete without it. So yeah, looking forward to actually meet the people and and spend some time. Thank you.
Yeah, I really have become very misty-eyed. Like, I just saw that comment of Surbhi telling she's become misty-eyed. Even I started becoming misty-eyed. It's like such a good transition, because it was a childhood dream for me to set up a museum. So I have a large collection since childhood. And finally, we set up the space and COVID hit. So we wanted to therefore transform it into a digital space, because we just couldn't open it up. And then we wanted to make it into an experiential digital museum. And I was like clueless how to do it. And to my utter luck, I get selected to this program with the best of cohort. Like, I cannot tell you, every museum curator who I look up to, like some museum god, is here. And on top of it, every curator is like, Padmini and all. I was like for years and years, following, and Rashmi and each of Archana, like at Jaga. So I was like mind blown with content. And the best part is like, the earlier person mentioned, I was like, I stay just a road away from the, Goethe-Institut in Bangalore. So I could have never dreamt of going to the Mumbai one and attending or anything. So I was like really thankful that it has happened during the thing. And also the festival of museums also happened online. So I was like really serendipitous. And on top of it, like this last exercise was so good that it just, mindfully just brought in the whole experience really, really well. And I'm doing those 2 cases that I promised earlier. So for the OER, so I'll definitely do an entire case on this program itself being a complete case in, how to do cultural management well. Like from the start to the end, I have just made notes, because I've attended so many festivals and events online. Hands down, this was the best. Like across domains, across spectrums I've attended, this was the best curated festival online. So I want to have a full case so that I can use it for my own practice. And also the learnings itself from my own perspective of curating the museum. What all I've had through the sessions, I'm going to, jot it all down and, put it together and put it up on the OER platform. So I just can't thank enough. So thanks a lot. Thank you so much.